Welcome to Module 9 of the PrepIt instructional presentations. This is part of a series of presentations on the use of the various features in the PrEP Implementation, Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation tool, or PrepIt. PrepIt is a decision-making and analysis tool with several interrelated modules used for target setting, costing, and commodities forecasting. This presentation is the 9th in a series of presentations on the features and functions of PrepIt. When setting targets in PrepIt, the tool accounts for several factors of the PrEP program, including the number of potential PrEP users in each priority population, PrEP continuation and reinitiation, initiation scale-up trends, the timing of introduction of new PrEP methods, and the desired coverage levels, as well as considering financial and/or commodities constraints. To begin, you set the date range over which the targets will be set. Use the drop-down lists to set the months and years for the date range, and then click on the Set Date Range button so that it turns gray. Different stakeholders may be interested in different time periods for targets. Use the longest time frame needed for your purposes. The tool will allow you to break out the targets by shorter time periods later if needed. We recommend a target setting period of no longer than 3 to 4 years. When setting targets, you start with specifying the population data. For each priority population, there are 4 key inputs needed to calculate the potential number of users of PrEP. First, there's the estimated size of the priority population. Next, there's the percent of the populations living in the geographic areas that have been prioritized for PrEP for the target setting exercise. For some countries, PrEP may be delivered everywhere, but there may be some areas where the HIV incidence is higher and their target setting exercise is focused on those areas. Next is the HIV prevalence of each population, as PrEP is only for those that are HIV negative. Finally, you need the percent indicated for PrEP, or the percent of the population in need of PrEP based on their likelihood of exposure to HIV. We will discuss this more in subsequent slides. These 4 data points are entered into PrepIt, and the number of potential users are calculated for each priority population. Based on the country you selected during the Getting Started module, the tool will pull in default values on population sizes, HIV prevalence, and the percent indicated for PrEP for the common priority populations. Note that default data are not provided for custom populations. That data will need to be entered in by the user. The sources for these data can be found by clicking on the Default Priority Populations button. Users should update the default data in the table to reflect the best and most updated data available and country-specific assumptions where necessary. The population size is the national size of the indicated priority population, which will come from country-specific data. The defaults come from country-specific data and are based on UNAIDS estimates, DHS surveys, and other sources. Note that there are different sources for different countries, and the defaults and sources shown are specific to the country selected when you started the PrepIt application. When data are available, you should overwrite the defaults provided in PrepIt with the latest estimates. As mentioned previously, you can have PrEP delivered everywhere, but there may be some areas where the incidence of the population is higher, and you want to make sure you have focused your program to be able to deliver it well in those areas. Your program will want to ensure product availability, demand creation, and provider training for these areas, and you may want to set your targets on these areas specifically. If this is the case, you need to enter the percent of the specified priority populations living in these areas. Another possibility is that you're setting targets for PEPFAR, and thus you would like to enter the percent of each population living in the PEPFAR-supported subnational areas. Since PrEP is for HIV-negative individuals, one must enter the HIV prevalence for each priority population. This will come from country-specific data. Default data are available from UNAIDS and other sources. When updated data are available, you should overwrite the defaults with the latest estimates. The percent indicated for PrEP means the percent of the priority population that is in need of PrEP based on their likelihood of exposure to HIV. This can be challenging to assess for some populations. The defaults in PrEP are based on DHS survey data on STI symptoms and condom use for adolescent girls and young women and pregnant and breastfeeding women. These numbers are offered as a guide, and you may want to adjust based on your own analysis or your own criteria. Due to the difficulty in estimating this metric, PrEP@SHIP version of the tool was created. PrEP@SHIP identifies the subset of each population in need of PrEP based on subnational incidence among the general population. There are some specific considerations when using PrEP for serodifferent couples. First, PrEP is recommended for HIV negative partners in the serodifferent couple, in which the HIV positive partner is not yet virally suppressed. The population size here is the total serodifferent couples in the country or geographic location, not just the ones that have been identified. The population size is estimated by the adult population size multiplied by the adult HIV prevalence multiplied by the percent of adults married or in union. HIV prevalence is always 0 for serodifferent couples because PrEP is provided by definition to the HIV negative partner. The percent indicated for PrEP should be the percent of HIV positive adults who are not virally suppressed. Additionally, there are some considerations for specifying population data for key populations. It can be challenging to quantify key populations, and usually there are specific exercises in each country that are designed to estimate the size and HIV prevalence of each key population. If a key population is clustered in specific geographic areas, you can still put 100% in the geographic area for PrEP, and later disaggregate to the regions where PrEP will be provided if that is preferred. In some cases, these populations may be mobile. Defaults for the percent indicated for PrEP in key populations are 100%. For men who have sex with men, you may want to change the percent to those who are sexually active and have at least one partner of unknown status. For female sex workers, you may want to change this to the percent that do not consistently use condoms. For people who inject drugs, you could change this to the percent that shares injecting equipment. There are also considerations when specifying this data for adolescent girls and young women and pregnant and breastfeeding populations. The starting total population size is available from census and survey data. And since these populations are so large in many countries, PrEP users will want to identify the subnational areas where HIV incidence is highest. These data are at the district level in the Naomi data and with behavioral categories in the SHIP tool. This is one of the main reasons why PrEP@SHIP was developed. For these populations, the percent indicated for PrEP should be limited based on certain criteria. For AGYW, PrEP should firstly be limited to those who are sexually active. In lower incidence areas, you may want to limit to a subset of this population with multiple partners or with STI symptoms. The default values show both of these metrics from national surveys. For custom populations, remember that no default values are provided, and you will need to determine what the appropriate data sources are. Next, we want to specify the scale-up patterns, which represent the rate at which PrEP initiations will roll out over the course of your target setting period. First, we want to set the number of scale-up patterns you want to use. Only one pattern is required, but more can be specified if the scale-up is expected to differ by priority population, method, or other dimension. PrEP starts with 3 adjustable default patterns shown, and you can add up to 10 more by clicking on the plus symbol, and you can delete any that are not needed by clicking on the delete symbol. There are three different types of scale-up patterns to consider when thinking about how targets will be achieved over time. An S-shaped pattern assumes a gradual start in the early months as the program is established, and then a steep increase before reaching an eventual plateau of initiations. This pattern is appropriate for newer prep programs with a target setting time period long enough to reach scale-up. The linear pattern assumes a steady increase in initiations each month, which may be appropriate if a program has been established and is now experiencing rapid scale-up. The constant pattern assumes the same number of initiations each month. This pattern is appropriate when your program has already scaled up and you do not anticipate an increase in prep initiations over the target setting period, although you can still increase coverage with a constant scale-up. In thinking about the S-shaped curve, the y-axis is the percent of the targets initiating each month. You can see that the initial months have a slow start. This is when you might be piloting in a few sites, training your staff, and preparing your demand creation. Gradually, the pace increases until you reach a rapid scale-up phase where you are expanding. Eventually, the program begins to saturate the population in need of prep, and initiation is at a plateau or near constant rate, and you are no longer expanding your resources. The midpoint represents the number of months from the beginning of the target setting period when prep initiations are scaling up most rapidly. Note that the midpoint does not have to be in the middle of the target setting period. It can be at 0 or even negative if your program has already reached peak scale up. On the graphs shown in PrepIt, the y-axis shows the proportion of the total target initiations that start in each month. Keep in mind that a higher line does not mean a greater number of initiations because the trend is applied to the total target number for each population and method. In addition to specifying the midpoint, you also need to specify the scale-up speed for an S-shaped curve. The speed controls how steep the rapid scale-up portion of the curve is and when the curve starts to flatten or plateau. For the speed, specify a number between 0 and 1, where it is visually best represents your expectations for program scale-up. You can adjust the speed of scale-up so that the rapid scale-up portion of the curve best covers the appropriate months when you expect your program will be increasing. In this example, you can see where a user specified 3 scale-up trends. First, there's a constant trend that was specified for a program that has matured and is now expecting about the same number of people initiating prep each month. For a constant trend, you do not need to specify the midpoint or the scale-up speed. Then we have 2 S-shaped trends. The first one is for a continuing program, where the midpoint is specified at 0, meaning that they expect that the fastest growth will happen at the very beginning of the target setting period. The other S-shaped curve is for a new program that is expected to start slowly and have the fastest growth during month 14, and then start leveling off around months 18 or 19. Next, we need to assign the scale-up trend to each priority population and method. For this example, the user applied the mature scale-up trend to all the oral prep users, while using the continuing trend for the ring users and the new program trend for the CAB users. Next, we turn to method mix. When multiple methods of prep are being used, you need to specify the method mix, which is the expected proportion of each priority population using each method by the end of the target setting period. Across all of your methods, the total method mix must add to 100%. If a priority population is not eligible for a specific method, and this was specified previously in the method section, then the value for that method will be 0 for that population. In the examples shown here, it is estimated that by the end of the target setting period, 40% of prep users who are in serodifferent couples will be taking oral prep, 30% ring prep, and 30% cab prep. For MSM, it is estimated as 50% of the oral prep users and 50% of the cab prep users. You can see that ring prep was zeroed out for this population because it was specified in the method section that MSM is not eligible for ring prep. All of the prior steps taken thus far have led us to the point where you will now be setting targets. You will see the program data period from where program data was entered, and as well as the data period for the target setting. Next, you'll be asked to specify a target setting option, which we will explore in the next slides. When setting targets, you select from one of three options on a drop-down list. Option 1 is setting targets based on coverage. This means specifying the percent of potential users in each priority population who will be actively taking PrEP at the end of the target setting period. This is the most common way in which people set targets and PrEP it. Note that coverage in this case is not defined as the percent of the population who has ever taken PrEP throughout the target setting period. That percentage would be higher. Now, the exception for this is for serodifferent couples who take PrEP until their partner is virally suppressed. PrEP-It treats this population differently, and for this population, coverage is the percent who initiates PrEP during the target setting period. Option 2 is to set targets by coverage, but to add in constraints, which can be financial constraints and/or constraint on the number of product that is available. Option 3 is for people who have already set targets under a different mechanism, but want to link them to the other modules in the tool. In this case, you can manually enter your targets for the number of initiations, including reinitiations, by method for each priority population. It's important to remind ourselves how conceptually coverage is handled in PrEP-It. In this tool, coverage is conceptualized as the percent of potential users that are actively using PrEP at any given time. Coverage in a given month is represented by the red bucket, or how full the bucket is, and it's affected by different factors, including the size of the specified population, which is represented by the blue pale above, the rate of initiations, which are those starting PrEP for the first time. This is represented by the flow from the blue bucket into the red bucket. The rate of discontinuations of those who have stopped taking PrEP, shown as leaking out of the red bucket. And the rate of reinitiations, or those restarting PrEP after a break, which can be seen moving back to the red bucket. It's important to note that the rate of initiations, discontinuations, and reinitiations can all vary by the different populations using PrEP and by PrEP method. When setting targets by coverage, enter in the percent of the number of potential users from each priority population that you want to be actively taking PrEP in the final month of the target setting period. Given what we know about continuation of PrEP, it's important to be realistic about what percent of the population will be taking PrEP at any given point in time, including at the end of the target setting period. The numbers entered should be realistic, and percentages close to 100% is generally not feasible. Also keep in mind that if you are using multiple PrEP methods, the total should reflect your desired coverage rate. In this example, the user entered a coverage rate of 50% for serodifferent couples, 15% for AGYW, and 40% for MSM and FSWs. You can see that the coverage by method was automatically calculated on the method based on the method mix previously specified. Perhaps you've calculated your targets based on your desired coverage, but you've found that the results exceed your budget or the available ARV supply for PrEP. In this case, you can return to the Set Targets page and select Coverage with Constraints option and enter in a maximum value in terms of US dollars or in the number of product units. Here I've added a financial constraint and a constraint on the number of cab PrEP units available. Once you've entered your constraints, you can click on the Calculate Targets button, and the results will adjust them to reflect these limitations. You'll be able to compare the proposed coverage percentage to the actual coverage that can be achieved under these constraints. Here you can see that while the user added a 50% coverage estimate for serodifferent couples, only 42% can be achieved given the constraints. The pattern is similar for other priority populations. The option is to manually add your targets. This option is useful if you've already estimated your targets using a different process and you would like to link to the other modules to estimate the costs, examine the impacts, and/or disaggregate to subnational areas. Simply enter the targets for each method in the table provided. Regardless of what option you use to estimate targets, once completed, click Next to advance to the next tab where you can review the target results. When reviewing the results, you can look at the targets for the entire time period, or you can look at a subset of time by adjusting the date range for the display and clicking on the Set Date Range button. The date range shown here captures 2 fiscal years for PEPFAR. For example, you may want to change the date range to look at the targets for just 1 year, or look at a different fiscal year that starts and ends at different months. If you set targets for more than one method, you can use the drop-down list to select the method to look at, or look at the combined targets. The results will show the overall targets for PrEP New, PrEP CT, all PrEP recipients, which is a global fund indicator, and currently on PrEP, which measures the number on PrEP in the final month of the target setting period. If you click on the info box, you will see the definitions of each indicator. Note that PrEP CT is given for the last quarter of the selected date range in the display. For PrEP recipients, the global fund indicator, the time period is a 6-month time period. So you'd want to change the date to select the 6-month time period to extract the targets for that particular indicator. The results also include the costs, HIV infections averted, and the cost per infection averted associated with targets for each priority population if you have completed the cost and impact modules. These results will also be available if you have manually entered in your targets. Another result to note is that the coverage achieved is usually lower than the percent of potential PrEP users who have initiated at some point in the target setting period. Again, the exception is for serodifferent couples who are treated differently due to their different patterns of PrEP use. It's common to see a warning in the results that some coverage targets could not be met. This means that due to the continuation rates, it was not possible to get to the level of coverage specified. Remember the bucket image. People are flowing out of the bucket too quickly to be able to achieve that level of coverage. Instead, you can look to the actual coverage to be achieved to see what coverage rate is feasible given the other inputs. There are several figures in the results that have additional details where you can see your monthly initiations, reinitiations, currently on PrEP, and PrEP coverage. This can be broken down by priority population and method. An example of one of the figures is shown here. Click on the 3 horizontal bars on the left of each figure if you want to download the image as a PNG or PDF file, or the data into a CSV file that can then be copied into an external spreadsheet. The next slide shows an example of the targets module inputs and reviews the outputs. So here we are on the targets page of PrEPit, and we're about to embark on setting our targets now. We're going to start with setting the target setting period. Remember, the program data period is put in here for your reference. And we want to make sure that if we're using program data, that it ends close to when we begin our targets. If there's more than a 4-month gap, the program data is not very helpful in having us understand which PrEP clients are going to be continuing into our target setting period. So I'm going to set a 3-year target setting range from starting in October 2024 to September 2027. So I'll make that adjustment. You can see that the color changed on this, so I'll press on it to affix the date. Okay, next we turn to this population table. And this is information on the population size, the percent prioritized for PrEP in terms of geographic areas, HIV prevalence, the percent indicated for PrEP, and through those we calculate the number of potential users. Now you can see that there are already data on this table coming from our default data. And the default data is specifically for those common priority populations that you select in the configuration. And those can be found here. So you can see where the data come from and the sources and assumptions. So the default data are for your use, but we also suspect in many cases you'll have better updated data to overwrite these defaults. So in this example, I'm going to say that we've done some more population estimates around our key populations. And so we are going to update this data, and that this is now here, and this is. Next, you'll note for our custom population, Fisher folk, we don't have any population size because we added this population during the configuration. So I'm going to have to add in this population as well. Next, we turn to this in percent in geographic areas prioritized for PrEP. If PrEP is going to be prioritized regionally and you want to specify the percent of these populations living in those prioritized areas. We're going to leave this as 100 for our example, but this is one place where you can make that adjustment. Next, we have HIV prevalence. Again, there's default data on prevalence with the exception of our custom population. But also you may have updated estimates. So maybe we can go in and say, okay, based on our updated estimates, we know this is 22, and this, our new estimate has this reduced a bit. We need to add this estimate for our custom population as well. Now we go into percent indicated for PrEP. And this can be a bit of a tricky indicator to figure out how you want to specify, especially for certain populations. In this case, the defaults show 100% for serodifferent couples and female sex workers. Maybe you want to add that as well for MSM, depending on how you want to specify, and this might be where you look to the guidelines. For adolescent girls and young women and other more generalized populations, this can be tricky to estimate. The defaults have data on DHS data, on percent with STI symptoms, or the percent that reported multiple partners and condomless sex. You can use those as a guide, or if you have other ways in which you want to estimate this, you can. I'm going to leave that there for now. And then again, I have to make this change for the custom population. I'm going to say this is 20%. Okay, so with that data now, you can see that we've calculated the number of potential users. That's the population size, that's HIV negative in our geographic areas that are indicated for PrEP. And with that complete, we can click on Next. So next we are up to the scale-up trends. And 3 trends are given to you to start with. And you need to think about what's happening in your program and how many different scale-up trends do you think you need. You need at least one scale-up trend, but you don't need one for every population or every population method combination. In this case, I think I'm going to start with a constant trend. I'm going to delete these others. So I'm starting with this constant trend, and this constant trend in this hypothetical program is for my serodifferent couples. This is a scaled up program, and they've been, we've kind of reached our saturation and now have a steady number each month initiating. For my second trend that I'm going to call oral PrEP. So for me, this is going to be an S-shaped And for this trend, we're going to assume that this program's been ongoing for a while and it's sort of nearing that kind of peak scale up. So I'm going to say that's going to happen early on in our target setting period where we're going to try to reach peak scale up. So you can see now this black line is showing how that's represented here. Now this next one, the initial speed of scale up. This is a bit tricky because there's no right answer in terms of the number, but it's between 0 and 1. And the closer it is to 1, the steeper the scale up is. So if I put this in at 0.9, you can see that this is like a very fast ramping up. Whereas if I were to put on the other side 0.1, you'll see it's much more gradual. So you need to think about your program and how you think it's going to be scaling up over the target setting period. In this example, I've got a program that has been scaling up previously, expected to reach peak scale up in the early months of the target setting period. And I'm going to say sort of like the moderate scale up trend like this. And we expect it to kind of level off and hit that plateau around October 2025. So this is really sort of an art in trying to figure out what makes the most sense for your particular program. Now I'm going to add a second S-shaped curve, and I'm going to call this one cab prep. And this is, in this hypothetical example, cab is going to be new. It's going to be introduced later, and we're expecting it to hit peak scale up really 18 months into the target setting period. And so you see that represented with this green line. And here now we're going to think about, well, once it really gets off the ground, it's established, it's introduced, the demand creation's ongoing, then we think people are going to really opting for cab prep. So we're going to give it a steeper scale up curve. So I gave it a 0.6, and this is sort of visually represents what I most expect is going to happen in my program in the coming target setting period. So once we have our scale up trend set, then we click on next. And this is where we apply a scale up trend to each priority population and method. So you can see they all defaulted to the first one. So we certainly need to make some adjustments. What I'm going to do is say for different couples, we're going to keep this SDC, this constant scale up trend for this particular cell here, but we'll switch it to the cab prep for that method. And now for the others, we're just going to do, this is our oral prep program for non-serodifferent couples. And this is our cab for all of these. So I'm just making these. The more trends you have, the more population you have, the more you may have to make these adjustments. Again, if you only have one scale up trend for your entire program, then this will be an easy step that you'll pass by quickly. Then we'll click next. So now we come to method mix, where if we have more than one type of prep, we need to specify the percent that I'll be using each method by the end of the target setting period. So this is when we get to, in this case, September 2027, how do we expect the allocation between, in this case, oral and cab prep to look? So there are a lot of different factors that might go into how you're going to make these projections. In my example, I'm going to put 50-50 for each population. Okay, now we can set targets. This is all our prior inputs have really culminated to this point. And remember, you have 3 different target setting options. Setting by coverage, which is commonly used. Setting by coverage but putting in some constraints. And then manually entering targets. If you were to manually enter targets, you would enter them here, and then it would connect to the other modules in the tool. But most of us have been working on this to set the targets based on this coverage method. And remember, coverage is the percent of our potential users who will be taking prep at the end of the target setting period. So we know some are going to start and will stop taking prep. Some might restart and take prep, all during our target setting period. But what percent do we think will be of each priority population will be taking prep then at September 2027 in this example? So we can't put this close to 100 because it wouldn't be able to factor in the people discontinuing and reinitiating. For serodifferent couples, we can put, somewhere close to 50% or even higher because of the way that population is treated differently in the tool. For others, it's more reasonable to think in terms of around 20% or to 40%, depending on the specifics of your program. I'm going to put in 20% for AGYW, 30 for these key pops, and I'm going to also put in 25 for my Fisher folk. And you can see that it automatically broke down by method based on the method mix we previously entered. Okay, so once we've done that, we could click next and see our results. But maybe we also are thinking, well, I would like to have a nice target, but I have financial constraints, or I have the amount of product constraints. Then we might want to rethink this and talk about our constraints. So let's say, for example, I'm going to put in a $2 million constraint, as well as saying I only have like 50,000 units of cab prep that I'm going to have over this target setting period. So then once we've added those constraints, we can calculate our targets pressing on this button, and you can see what's happened. So instead of getting our 50% coverage, we're only going to get half as much. For serodifferent couples, similarly with our other populations as well. Maybe I'm using this for advocacy and I say, what if we have 100,000? What if we have 3 million instead of 2 million? Now let's calculate targets. And you can see here how we're getting closer to our goal, but not quite reaching it based on these constraints. So these are the types of things you can do to understand how your targets can be affected by these constraints and how to make those adjustments. And click next. And now what our program's doing is it's saying, okay, here are your results. And it gives the information for the entire target setting period. Let's say you want to just see it for fiscal year 2025. You can also say, show me these results just for this period as well. And it makes these adjustments. And you can look at it by different methods, or you can look at them combined. And you can see these different indicators: prep new, prep CT, the total number of prep certificate recipients, and the currently on prep. And information on those are available here. Additionally, you can see information on the total costs and the total infections averted, as well as the cost per infection averted for each priority population. And you can see that by the different methods as well. There's a lot of other data below, looking at initiations, reinitiations, looking at information by population, etc. Remember, for all of these, you can download them as charts, but you can also download the data themselves. So you could download a CSV file, and if you were to open that up in like Excel, you'd be able to have that data for you to utilize in your own way. Another feature you might want to examine is showing the program data. So you can do that here, and it'll show you the information, bringing in your program data that's leading up into your target setting area. So those are the basic steps in the target setting module, and we'll end there on this particular video. Thanks. For more information on setting targets and other functions of Prep-It, please join the Prep-It community of practice. You can enter questions with the hashtag targets so that others can learn from your question as well.